Okay, good afternoon and welcome to our session 3 of the TERMIS-PAP programme. So as part of the TERMIS International Society, we aim to provide a programme which actually introduces people to the commercial aspects behind tissue engineering, outlining the business propositions in the field and the main challenges to get you to creating a commercial entity. So we aim through this session to actually give you an overview of the regulation in the industry itself, and as well as that, we hope to introduce you to our launch of the TERMIS-BBC 2017 programme. So today on the line we have Julian Hitchcock, who joined us last week actually. So we have a recording of the session, followed by Dr. Christopher Bravery. So online we've got MacKenna who'll be chairing the session, and Tracy, who's the chair of the TERMIS-BBC programme. So I'm going to pass over to them to introduce the schedule for this afternoon and for the start of our talks.
Thank you, Shiraz. First, I'd like to say thank you to you and the organizers of TERMIS-EU Pre-Accelerator program for inviting each of us, and I think for arranging this session, which I think is going to be an invaluable resource. So thank you. We have here today an all-star cast to introduce the regulation of tissue engineered and regenerative medicine, so cell and gene-based therapies. And my name again is MacKenna Roberts. I'm the chair for the session today. I'm a life sciences lawyer and bioethicist specialized in regenerative medicine, and I also am an IP consultant. So we're going to start today. As Shiraz mentioned, we already pre-recorded Julian Hitchcock, who is going to be speaking to you in a moment. Julian, I can say, is a lawyer extraordinaire in regenerative medicine law. He has had a long career with many different hats, but that began with studying medicine at the University of Birmingham. And then he had a career in production in the BBC, as one does when they study medicine. He went on to then qualify as a lawyer, and he has been specialized in the life sciences for almost 20 years now. So you're in very good hands with him, and he will be introducing the legal backdrop and regulatory framework that any company or researcher needs to know in developing a tissue engineered or regenerative medicine therapy. And I will hand it over to Julian to go into his slides, but I will mention very quickly that I cannot possibly name all the subcommittees and initiatives he's involved with, but he is involved with many and has been throughout many years in parallel with his career. And he's particularly been involved with stem cell science and much of the policy that's been developed for the regulation of stem cell science in that field. So he has great knowledge. He's going to pass over to you the background information you need for what you need to know in your therapies. Thank you.
Well, hello, I'm Julian Hitchcock, and I'm from Denoon Legal, which is a life science only practice based in London. And we're a member of the Alliance of European Life Science Law Firms with offices around the continent. And today I want to talk to you about the regulation within the EU of tissue engineered and regenerative medicine products. So in overview, just two main elements to this talk. First of all, what the key requirements are for ATMPs, advanced therapy medicinal products, within the EU and the UK, I should say, and case studies to illustrate it. So first of all, this is what regulation, I think, looks like to most of us. There you are. Everything joined up, everything clear, logical, and a reassuring framework within which you can move. As you see, that's actually the fiction. The reality is, of course, this. I'm going to try and get you from the reality to something which approximates that earlier slide. Okay, so EU regulation. What is going to be relevant here? Well, there are two fundamental pieces of regulation which apply to tissue engineered and regenerative medicine products. They are, in Europe, EU TCD, that stands for the European Tissue and Cell Directive, and the ATMP regulations. For all practical purposes, we're talking about two bits of law. One is one of those, one directive and one regulation there. But there's some other things which come in. So, sorry about the list, and especially about the numbers. But Medicinal Products Directive. We're going to be talking about the Medicinal Products Directive insofar as the regulation of ATMPs, Advanced Therapy Medicinal Products, are regulated as medicines. We'll also be talking about a regulation of the same name. Doesn't matter too much about that. Essentially, that's to do with the single European market. We'll also talk, there's also a relevance in some areas with the Medical Devices Directive and active implantables, because sometimes a tissue engineered product particularly may act in two ways. It may also be a device. And finally, we may actually find, to the surprise of some, that actually we're also subject to GMO regulation. Okay, so it's a lot of law, but don't be worried. We can drill down into some key points in that. So first of all, the EU TCD, the European Tissue and Cells Directive. What is it about? Well, it's really about the quality and safety of tissues and cells that are used clinically. So through that route from acquisition to grafting, donation, procurement, all the testing, processing, preservation, storage, distribution, that has got to be clean so that at the end of the day, the quality is of the standard that we would expect. So the framework is set out in what is generally referred to as the EU TCD, but it's two little friendly subordinate directives which you don't need to worry about right now, but I've just included for those who are a bit nerdy. And I just draw out of that an issue which we're going to look at a bit later, which is about tissues and cells which are used as autologous grafts within the same surgical procedure. Now, for reasons which I think common sense perhaps illustrates, they're exempt, and that's really because the donation, procurement, testing, processing, preservation, storage and distribution all take place in that surgical suite. So they are exempt from the EU TCD, and that will be relevant later. Okay, so how does the ATMP regulation, which we're going to come to, relate to the EU TCD? Well, first of all, let's be clear about our language again, where ATMP is Advanced Therapy Medicinal Product, and I apologise to those of you who are very well aware of that fact, but let's get it clear. So the ATMP regulation of 2007, which applies across the EU and in fact the European Economic Area as a whole, doesn't derogate from the basic principles laid down in the ETCD. So all the requirements as to quality and safety essentially remain intact. But so the EU TCD applies to donation, procurement and testing. But processing, the way something is processed, preserved, stored and distributed, which there is some overlap, is covered by the ATMP regulation. There are relevant national implementing measures that come into play, which we don't need to worry about here. So to all intents and purposes, we're talking about a uniform EEA regime. Now, forgive me if this is familiar to some of you. This is originated actually with the EMA in the early days of the Advanced Therapy Medicinal Product Regulation, just to try and explain why we have it. Now, just ignoring the legal terms and just looking at the, if you like, the products and delivery of medicine which is taking place, notionally there's a continuum, one might say, between medical devices at one end and medicinal products at the other. And certainly throughout the 90s and beyond, there was began to become apparent that there were curious things which might work between the two in terms of their mode of action. And in that, the bar below, the purpley bar, it just shows you what that means scientifically. So drilling down a bit, you've got tissue engineering as a bit more devicey. Biotech is sort of towards pharmaceuticals, but it's not actually the same as a gene therapy or a cell therapy product, which we're going to look at. Anyway, to regulate the ATMP regulation, it was deemed early on that we needed to get people from across Europe, simply to get a body of people that would be able to be sufficiently expert in these different areas And I should say including medical devices, so the slide should really extend a bit over there, to cover those areas. So CAT, the Committee for Advanced Therapies, which we'll come to, covers tissue engineering, cell therapy and gene therapy, but actually it also has expertise in medical devices. CHMP, which is a different committee within the European Medicines Agency, Committee for Healthcare Medical Products, is medicinal products, is at the other end. It's to do with pharmaceuticals and biotech. Okay, the ATMP regulation. So what is it and how does it work? Well, key to the whole architecture is a centralised marketing authorisation procedure. You put your application in the post box and you get authorised across the European Economic Area. Well, that's the idea. As we'll see, it's not always quite as straightforward as that, and that just judging by the numbers of actual marketing authorisations, you can be the judge of that. But that's the idea, and it's something which is used for biological medicinal products generally, and indeed other products. So it's a very efficient way of getting authorisation across the EEA. I mentioned CAT, the Committee for Advanced Therapies, and as I said, it's a multidisciplinary expert committee, and its job is to assess products and follow scientific developments. Its job is primarily, as is that of the EMA, scientific. Now, ATMPs have, as you would expect, specific GMP, good manufacturing requirements, but specific to the many idiosyncrasies of different ATMPs. Other feature of the ATMP regulation is special incentives for SMEs. Many think that perhaps there should be special incentives to higher education institutions, which generally speaking are the generators of much of this technology. There's also a requirement for risk management and long-term traceability in particular, and for post-authorization pharmacovigilance systems. Again, you'd expect that, and especially with something as complicated as an advanced therapy medicinal product. Now, it breaks down into three. There are three classes of ATMP. Gene therapy medicinal products, somatic cell therapy medicinal products, and tissue engineered products. I apologise for all the words. I promise this will be painless. Actually, I'm just joking, it will be painful. Right, so what is a GTMP, a gene therapy medicinal product? Well, first of all, it's a biological medicinal product. We'll come to why that might be significant. Just to get your eyes flicking around the screen, right down to the bottom, it's not a vaccine. So it doesn't include vaccines against infectious diseases. But focusing on the middle, you have A. So it contains an active substance which contains or consists of a recombinant nucleic acid used in or administered to human beings with a view to, and this bit's important as we'll see this wording elsewhere, regulating, repairing, replacing, adding or deleting a genetic sequence. So it's actually focused on, if you like, gene surgery, if you will. And the other characteristic is that those effects, the therapeutic, prophylactic, or diagnostic effects, never forget the diagnostic incidentally, relates directly to the sequence, to the recombinant sequence it contains, or to the product of the genetic expression of this sequence. Now this talk is short, but I want you to think about some of the emerging issues here, and one of those is the word recombinant nucleic acid. Some of you, perhaps most of you, will be aware of CRISPR, clustered, regularly interspaced,
palindromic repeats.
There you go, palindromic repeats. So CRISPR, Cas9 and other editing technologies, and a question arises, is the product of that a recombinant nucleic acid? My view is that almost certainly it will be regarded as that anyway, but it's something which troubles some people. So, right, what is it again? So the biological product, so what does that mean? Well, it means that synthetic oligonucleotides aren't GTMPs, okay? Going to synthetic biology and indeed using false nucleotides. The effects must, we said, relate directly to that sequence. It includes viral and non-viral vectors. So again, we can envisage a situation where you have a non-viral CRISPR-designed vector. It doesn't have to be viral. And of course, as we said, vaccines aren't included. Now, there are two types that we can identify, and this perhaps is the bit you should try and remember, if you remember anything from this talk. Ex vivo ones and in vivo GTMPs. So if the active substance, which is a cell, contains a recombinant nucleic acid, which is then administered, so the cells are then administered, having been modified. That's an ex vivo GTMP. I'm sure you can all think about examples of that in relation to immunotherapies. The other sort is the in vivo, which is where the recombinant nucleic acid virus is the active substance which is directly applied. So there are those two. I mentioned earlier on the perhaps surprising idea that actually gene therapy products are GMOs. Don't be alarmed, but let's just try and understand why that might be so. So I mentioned again briefly a directive on GMOs, 2001-18. You don't need to know that, but just look at this definition. So it says this. It says this first of all: organisms, with the exception of human beings, in which the genetic material has been altered in a way that does not occur naturally by mating and/or natural combination. That is a genetically modified organism. Okay, so you have that. And what is an organism then? Any biological entity capable of replication or of transferring genetic material. So gene therapy medicinal products generally be classed as GMOs. No, because this talk is short, I can't go into the detail on this. However, don't be alarmed. The key thing is to be alert to creating a risk management plan and actually taking further advice. Right, that's gene therapy medicinal products. What about the other two? Starting with somatic cell therapy medicinal products. These come up a lot inevitably. So again, it's a biological medicinal product. And it has these characteristics. Again, contains or consists of cells or tissues that have been subject to substantial manipulation. Substantial manipulation, which we're going to come to in a little bit, because it's a leaden term. So that the biological characteristics, physiological functions, or structural properties relevant for the intended clinical use have been altered, or of cells or tissues that are not intended to be used for the same essential functions in the reception and the donor. There are actually, I've highlighted substantial manipulation, but actually we'll also be looking at same essential functions. Those are going to be important. The other characteristics of a somatic cell therapy medicinal product is that they're presented in a particular way as having properties for, or they're used in or administered to a human being with a view to treating, preventing, or diagnosing a disease through, not too surprisingly, the pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic action of its cells or tissues. Those last words, of course, are familiar from pharmaceutical law generally, so you can see how that relates. But there are differences to other properties for which an ATMP may be presented, as we'll see. And here we are. Here is that exact example in the third class. So this is a tissue-engineered product, a TEP. What is it? It's a product that contains or consists of engineered cells. Oh, now all these phrases are coming to your mind at the moment. I'll just flip back. So you've got substantial manipulation. That's hanging on a peg in your brain. You've also got hanging on that peg or another peg. You've got the same essential function. We'll come into both of those, but there's another word here, engineered. So this tissue-engineered product contains or consists of engineered cells or tissues. And it's presented again as having properties, blah, 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 with a view to, this time it's different. Remember, with the somatic cell, it was with a view to treating, preventing, or diagnosing a disease. What about a TEP? With a view to regenerating, repairing, or replacing a human tissue. Okay, so there's a difference of purpose. Right, let's look at that word engineered, this characteristic of a tissue engineered product. Well, to be engineered, first off, one approach is that they have got to be substantially manipulated. If you look down to the second of those bullet points, there's our old friend, same essential function. But you have either they've got to be substantially manipulated so that the characteristics, the biological characteristics, physiological functions or structural properties are achieved for the intended purpose, the regeneration, repair, replacement are achieved. Or, second of those bullet points, they're intended to be used for something different between what they did in the recipient and what they did in the donor. So taking fat cells and using them for a different non-fat related function perhaps is going to be a different essential function, but we'll come to that. I want to look at substantial manipulation. So what does it mean? Because plainly we do a lot of things when we're processing cells. Are they all going to be substantial manipulations? It could be crazy. That would make all sorts of things tissue engineered products. Well, very wisely, the European Commission, in proposing the ATMP regulation, adopted American practice. And in fact, this is virtually a photocopy of the American equivalent. So those of you listening or in the States, watching this in the States, will recognize this list. So these are things which are not substantial manipulations. Very standard: cutting, grinding, lyophilization, filtering, centrifugation, sterilizing, vitrification. So a lot of things there which are emphatically stated not to be substantial manipulations. Now the reason I say emphatically stated is because we may find that there's a little bit of contrariness going on in terms of from the regulator later on. But there we are. That's the list. That's like your get out of jail free. Let's just look at what they really meant. So the travaux préparatoires, that just means the papers that led up to the concluding final agreed ATMP regulation. They make it clear that the tests for substantial manipulation and same essential functions track the FDA tests, as we've said. Let's just look then at what the US position very briefly. So they don't use the expression substantial manipulation as we do in Europe. The expression there, as many of you will be aware, is minimal manipulation. And the equivalent law in the States says for structural tissue processing, for structural tissue it means processing that does not alter the original relevant characteristics of the tissue relating to the tissue's ability for construction, repair, or replacement. And for cells or non-structural tissues, processing does not alter the relevant biological characteristics of cells or tissues. In a short talk, I just hope you'll see the similarities there. Okay, so to be clear, we've looked at substantial manipulation. We've said it's a way out of, if it's not substantial manipulation, it's a way out of being regulated as a tissue engineered product. But you might have something that is not actually substantially manipulated, but which is not used for the same essential functional functions in the recipient as in the donor. Let's just look at the equivalent US position here. So homologous use is the expression used in the States, meaning the repair, reconstruction, replacement, or supplementation of a recipient's cells or tissues with an HCTP that performs the same basic function or functions in the recipient as in the donor. So there we are, the same basic function or functions in the recipient as the donor. It looks similar. In the States, there's a relatively conservative practice as to the meaning of that. Here, the meaning of same essential function is applied inconsistently, to be frank, and one raises the question whether it's wider than the US test. Now, this slide is perhaps academic in the UK, but it's important to go through it. So, there are exemptions, as in so many areas. So an ATMP, which is prepared on a non-routine basis, according to specific quality standards, used in the same member state, in a hospital, under the exclusive professional responsibility of a medical practitioner, in order to comply with an individual medical prescription for a custom-made product for an individual patient, it's exempt. It's very narrow. You can see how narrow that all is. But even if you are exempt from the provisions of the Medicinal Products Directive, still have to make sure that the manufacturing is authorised in the appropriate way. So you have to apply, so GMP, QP release, pharmacovigilance requirements are just the same as for an ATMP. And also there must be it's got to comply with national traceability and pharmacovigilance requirements, which actually accord with the medicinal products regulation, which is, if you like, the EU-wide medicinal products regulation, to put it simply. So it's a narrow exception, and it's very, very, very infrequently used in the UK, although it is more used in other European states, which in fact almost are set up to use it. As far as I know, there's only been one application in the UK. If there's another one, congratulations. It is possible, if you were to use it, to charge for therapies, but of course there's a perception that it's an abuse of the system. But I should just point out that UK law explicitly restricts commercial activities insofar as you're not allowed to advertise in such a way. You can't advertise relating to that product, and the sale and supply is limited anyway. It can only be in response to an unsolicited order. So I say it's a hot topic, but I think it's cooling off quite a lot. So member states are responsible for implementing it. The UK doesn't do it very much. We have got regulations in relation to it, but it's not used very much. Lack of clear guidance, so there's inconsistency, and many member states are reluctant to grant the exemption for clinical trials, phase 1 trials. So lots of variation, and it's a topic that's much discussed, and it's becoming increasingly uninteresting. More relevant is the specials exemption, which is something which existed anyway in the Medicinal Products Directive. So this is a provision from the directive. When I talk of directives, they're implemented throughout Europe in national law. So it's implemented in the UK in our own regulation, but I gather I'm speaking more widely. A member state may, in accordance with legislation in force and to fulfil special needs, exclude from the provisions of this directive, that's the Medicinal Products Directive, medicinal products which are supplied in response to a bona fide unsolicited order, formulated in accordance with the specification of an authorised healthcare professional, and for use by his or her individual patients on his or her direct responsibility in order to fulfil the special needs of those patients. Believe me, it is different. I'm going to show you the differences on the next slide. But one thing I would pick up is that it's possible to export those materials, although again there are significant commercial restrictions. And I've just put at the bottom the relevant UK implementation of that directive, for what it's worth. Okay, I said I'd compare them, and maybe you'll be able to see why, in the UK at least, the special scheme is the one that people tend to use. So it must be prepared, the ATMP must be prepared and used in the same member state, but the equivalent of the specials is that the product meeting the same scheme requirement can be manufactured or imported into the UK. So an ATMP under the use regulation exemption must be commissioned by a medical practitioner, while products can be, to get specials, the specials exemption can be prescribed by doctors, dentists and supplementary prescribers. The ATMP for the hospital use exemption must be custom made to meet an individual prescription, on the preparation must be on a non-routine basis. Well, the specials, there's a special needs test, which is interpreted to mean the absence of a pharmaceutically equivalent and available licensed product. Note, that's probably the most important thing. And whereas the hospital use exemption does actually refer to a hospital, specials doesn't actually specify a location. So there are clear advantages to using the special scheme. Now, earlier on I mentioned that the Committee for Advanced Therapies was set up because of its expertise in medical devices. And sometimes an advanced therapy medicinal product can be kind of complicated. So it might, for example, include as an integral part a medical device or more than one medical device within the specific meanings. So what is a combination ATMP? Well, this is an ATMP that includes a device or maybe more than one medical device as defined by one of the medical device directives. The first of those is just called the Medical Devices Directive. The second refers to active implantable directives. We don't need to worry about those specifically right now. But in any event, the combination ATMP also, of course, has a cellular and tissue part. And the definition requires that the cellular tissue part either contains viable cells or tissues, okay, or the non-viable tissues or cells are the bits that do the device thing, okay? So the fact that something includes a device does not mean that the device element is somehow immune from those requirements under those two directives that I've mentioned. So the device element must comply with the, quote, essential requirements of the relevant medical device directive. And the medical devices directives essentially are annexes. Obviously there are some rules with those annexes. That's, if you like, is the bit that I do as a lawyer. But the technical part is the checklist. So to ensure compliance with the requirements, a notified body, which is the organisation which looks at compliance and ultimately certifies, it will look at how a device complies with the standards set out in those directives, and those are called the essential requirements for those specific devices. So fairly common sense actually that the device element would comply with the device laws. But the whole product, the whole combination ATMP product, is subject to final evaluation by the European Medicines Agency. Now I know that hanging over this for those with an interest in the UK is how is that going to work after Brexit, and perhaps we can look at that later. At the moment it's unknown, but I think in default you'd have to go to the Medicines and Healthcare Regulation Agency. The marketing authorization for a combination ATMP must include evidence of compliance with the relevant essential requirements, as well as available assessments of the device part by a notified body, except where the Committee for Advanced Therapies deems that it's not required. It's very, very broad brush. Now, let's look at some case studies, and I'd like in particular to look at an area which frankly dominates this area of regenerative medicine: autologous cells. So the unique status of autologous cells is reflected in the EU TCD, which you remember is all about quality and safety. So again, that applies to donation, procurement, testing, and preservation and storage and so forth. So it applies to cells that are derived autologously, but it doesn't insofar as the graft takes place in the same surgical procedure. So if you like, the point there is that it does apply, that the European Tissue and Cell Directive does apply to autologous cells if they're processed away from the surgical suite. Now, this is out of date. Frankly, there are far few ATMPs now, and I apologise, but really what I wanted to do is highlight how many of the ATMPs which were approved as of September 2013 are actually autologous. I'm sorry that my ring moved a little bit on the top line there. But just the very fact that so many are autologous, I think tells us something about how prevalent they are. And my understanding is that they are extremely prevalent. So let's just think, this is a case study, so let's just think of a problem here. So we know this, we know advanced therapy medicinal products are a subset of medicinal products that use viable human cells. You have multiple phases and years of clinical trials. You have GMP manufacturing, pharmacovigilance, and tracing obligations. So a lot of obligations if something is, if you like, an advanced therapy medicinal product that's placed on the market. Or what about this? Is the thing we're talking about, this autologous cell, is it this? Is it, autologous graft within the same surgical procedure? So you've got minimal manipulation, homologous use. So something like bone marrow transplants and transfusions, or PRP. That's when you boost platelet enrichment, basically procedures. For example, sports people use it sometimes. Let's look at this as a particular issue then. So that's the background thing. Is something basically practice of medicine, or is it actually an ATMP requiring a lot? So spinal fusion, let's imagine spinal fusion. So a bit of bones extracted from my hip. It's processed in a lab, let's say it's processed in the theatre to promote growth. The bone graft is then inserted into my back between two vertebrae to fuse together two of my terribly painful vertebrae to make a solid bone. Okay, so the grafted material is autologous, absolutely. It's maybe been substantially manipulated in the operating theatre, and arguably it's not used homologously. So maybe there's a difference between structural bone, as in my bone graft, and flexible. So there may be arguably some difference there. That's one thought. Now, should that be an ATMP? Well, it hasn't been. What about the famous cabbage procedure? So this time I'm in for another operation. So my saphenous veins are whipped out of my leg, extracted, and all the guff is stripped through it, okay? And it's then used to bypass some horrible atherosclerotic narrowings in my heart to improve the blood supply. Okay, so let's look at what's going on there. Well, first of all, let's agree it's my saphenous vein that's been used. That means it's autologous. The cells, the tissues that are used are autologous. It's relatively minimally manipulated, just stripped off the lining, if you will. And arguably, it's not used homologously because the saphenous vein is a bit different from the cardiac artery, for example, just notionally. Is that an ATMP? Hasn't been. And so these are sort of issues which, if you like, trouble my colleague and I, and we puzzle over these things. But the Committee for Advanced Therapies does provide advice. It publishes its guidance on particular, makes certain scientific decisions. And so in 2011, it concluded that a concentrated autologous bone marrow-derived mononuclear cells intended for use in patients after myocardial infarction is an ATMP. Well, let's just think that went through. What's the active substance? Easy. Autologous bone-derived mononuclear cells, okay? What's the finished product? Well, it's a suspension of a concentrate of the same thing. What's it for? It's for improving heart function, quality of life in people with ischemic post-acute myocardial infarction in a chronic heart disease. That's what it's for. Okay, what's the mode of action? Not quite sure, but the most likely mechanisms are regeneration through stem cell-induced angiogenesis, say parenchymal effects, if you like, in ischemic heart disease by non-hematological differentiation. Maybe no one really knows, okay? Well, to put it very simply, Catt assumed that the cells had not been substantially manipulated. It was just easier to say that they hadn't been to get to where they wanted to go. So, what really matters here is that they acknowledged that the cells naturally provide paracrine effects, but they concluded that the essential function of such cells is hematological restoration, and that the cells are therefore not used homologously. So by defining the essential function exercising their legal discretion to define the essential function, they succeeded in getting to where they wanted to go to, which was to say that the cells are not used homologously. Let's look at another example in this autologous domain, adipose cells. So 2012, CAP concluded that cryopreserved adipocytes used as a lipofiller was not an ATMP. Now, that seems to make a lot of sense intuitively, but the reason was that the cells were minimally manipulated, okay, and they're used for the same essential purpose. What's this same essential purpose? Let's have a little look at the decision. Well, the active substance, again, autologous non-manipulated lipoaspirate containing adipocytes and stromal vascular function. Finished product, cryopreserved adipocytes and a stromal vascular function. And the intended use? Well, a natural autologous lipofiller. A natural autologous lipofiller. So the purpose was a restoration of subcutaneous fat tissue, and there are no medical or therapeutic claims. But to say that fat cells are natural fillers is perhaps a little bit of a push if you just put on your Darwinian specs. So this does not appear to be cells used within the same procedure. So just to add to that, because it's not in one surgical suite, the EU-TCD would apply about quality and safety. But the real question then is, when do cells become medicine? So when does an autologous graft become an ATMP? So if the cells are viable and they're used medically, then they will be a tissue engineered product, a TEP. On these conditions, remember? So we've done this before. So if the cells are substantially manipulated so as to alter the essential biological characteristics, or the cells are used for some different function, and more specifically, the cells are used for the same essential function in the donor as in the recipient, are not used. So, and that will apply to autologous and allogeneic applications. But note that even if cells are tissue engineered products, in order to be subject, or rather to be the proper subject of a marketing authorization, they must also be intended to be placed on the market and produced industrially. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is forgotten rather a lot. We're going to come to that, but I think it would be handy right now just to try and get a bit of geography. So look, you have your product. First question. To get to it, was something substantially manipulated? Yes or no? Okay. Let's say we went yes. Well, there you are. You're a tissue engineered product. No, it wasn't. It wasn't substantially manipulated. I just spun it around in a centrifuge. Okay. So you're using it for the same essential function? No, I'm not actually. I'm sticking it somewhere else. Sorry, you're regulated. So that's the way you have to conceive of this issue. But the real pinch points are, as you can see, whether something is substantially manipulated and whether something has the same essential function. And that is where the regulator's discretion can sometimes perhaps be a little expansive or even unclear. So that's our background. But as I said in the previous slide, what if there's no intention of placing the product on the market? Okay. What if that happens? Well, hello, pussy. Maybe it has no place there. Is cat even relevant? So we need to think about whether something is really placed on the market. And this, I guess, is something which regulators tend to ignore because it doesn't really fall within regulation. Rather, regulation falls within the law, which is fundamentally about placing on the market, at least in terms of European law. So the Medicinal Products Directive, which governs ATMPs ultimately, only applies to industrially produced medicinal products for human use that are intended to be placed on the market. So, in the context of medical devices, we actually get some advice on what this might mean. So placing on the market means the first making available in return for payment with a view to distribution and or use in the community market. Okay, so I'm going into the surgical suite. Someone is going to remove my liver cell and they're going to put it back into me. Okay, is it really being placed on a market? It doesn't really look like CAT's business, does it? CAT is, after all, a scientific committee. It's not a legal committee. Fundamentally, it is even above the ambit of the European Medicines Agency. It's more a matter for the Commission and indeed of European law as a whole. Now, let's move on from that rather important point and just look at classification under CAT. So there's an incentive there's no fee for classification. It's not mandatory, it's open to all applications. And CAT provides scientific recommendations, which we've seen a few, on the regulatory classification. So more specifically about the particular class of ATMP, for example. And there is a procedure. But what you should particularly notice is the publication of the summary information on classification. And that may be inconvenient, actually. It might be a problem. They're not binding, but people might tend to follow them. And so national authorities or all the guidance you get on the route will tend to look, as we have just a little while ago, at previous CAT decisions. I'll just give you a quick word or two on the framework for CAT so that you have a bit of a feel of the geography. So the European Medicines Agency is established under the regulation which I mentioned before, the Medicinal Products Regulation. So that establishes the European Medicines Agency, which is like top agency in the EU and in effect the EEA, and it's responsible for coordinating existing scientific resources put at its disposal by member states for evaluation, supervision and pharmacovigilance of products. And it provides member states, community institutions with best advice. That's what it does. Okay, so the bottom line there is that this is a scientific committee. So CAT and the other committees are actually there to provide scientific advice. CAT itself was established by the ATMP regulation, that's Regulation 1394/2007, as a committee within the European Medicines Agency. So think of it as effectively a scientific committee. CAT's tasks basically are to, first of all, if the other committee on Healthcare Medicinal Products, asked it to do so, to formulate draft opinions on quality, safety and efficacy of ATMPs for final approval, to advise on whether the product falls within the definition. That, I think, is the big one, the classification issue. And also to provide advice to the Committee on Healthcare and Medicinal Products on medicinal products in scientific areas that are relevant to their, that includes ethics, which strangely. So it has a range of different functions within the European medicines agencies, which are all fundamentally scientific. But it's this one that I wanted to highlight here because it is relevant. So just to recap, so one of its jobs is to advise on whether the product falls within the ATM definition. Such advice to be delivered by the European Medicines Agency after consultation with the Commission. Now that phrase, after consultation with the Commission, actually suggests a little bit of a tension. And indeed, the Commission doesn't necessarily agree with the European Medicines Agency. So one problem that people often experience is a feeling that they can't readily, judicially review decisions by the European Medicines Agency. So it comes as, if you like, a welcome relief to see that the Commission has been smacked down, shall we say, over its interference with the European Medicines Agency. But it suggests that the Commission won't automatically endorse, in many occasions, what the EMA says, and there's a little bit of difference here. So, first of all, this is just, the matters of this aren't directly relevant, but it is relevant insofar as there is an exemption under the Medicinal Products Directive in relation to well-established medical use. So if something has been used over and over again, it ought to be a heck of a sight easier to go for a marketing authorization on the basis that everyone has been using aspirin, say, for so many years. In this case, in laboratoire CTRS, the relevant substance was cholic acid, and it had just been used for years and years and years under the specials exemption that we've seen before. So the EMA accepted that on the basis it had been used, under a well-established medical use basis, it didn't need any data. So, but the Commission, the European Commission, disagreed. It refused to grant the marketing authorization. This is policy, really. They just didn't like it. Now, the outcome, rather intriguingly, was that the Court of Justice quashed every single argument of the European Commission on the basis that, and actually very clearly, actually, when I say clear implication, it was pretty explicit, that the Commission had put policy before law. So what do you take from that? Well, first of all, I guess it gives you an understanding of how the European Medicines Agency, the whole regime, sits within the broader scheme of European law. But it also reminds us that marketing authorizations ultimately come from the Commission, and that there is some tension between the European Medicines Agency and the Commission, which could be played upon. I can't really go into that, but there it is. Very finally, I want to show you something which is designed to irritate patent attorneys. Enjoy. So first of all, sorry patent attorneys, patents are inferior. Now I speak actually as a former patent litigator, but let's just go through this. So an application for authorization is not required to provide the results of preclinical tests and of clinical trials if the applicant can demonstrate that the medicinal product is a generic of a reference product which is or has been authorized. Okay, so what are we talking about here? This is an application for a medicinal product, and it means that if someone else has already submitted data, that actually you won't have to provide data because the data is available. However, the person who first put the data in support, the clinical trial data essentially, submitted that in support of application number 1, gets 8 years of data exclusivity. No one can see that data for 8 years. After that, it becomes visible, but you continue to have 2 years of exclusivity on the market. Okay, no patents relevant here. Forget patents, this is a different sort of right. Now, already, given that medicinal products do take a very long time to come to market, especially ATMPs, and the amount of time remaining on a patent may be particularly slender, this sort of exclusivity is really serious, but it gets better. And then if you find a new indication for your drug, in this case ATMP, then you get another year. Now that's sort of good. It gives you exclusivity, which is what, after all, what investors want. But it gets better. So consider the obvious. On the left we have our old friend aspirin. On the right we've got factor 7, which is appreciably bigger. So as a crude surrogate of meaning here, we could look at molecular weight, and essentially the higher the molecular weight, the harder it is to actually say that something is the same. So if someone submits data on aspirin and someone else comes along and submits data, wants to get authorization for aspirin, it's easy. It's aspirin. We know every little molecule and electron in the molecule. As you move on up, it becomes harder, and ultimately it becomes impossible. So is there ever going to be a biosimilar cell? Probably not. So what does that mean? Let's look at what you get under a patent. Well, we've talked about exclusivity in both cases. So you get it, obviously a patent is an exclusive right. The right you get under a marketing authorization is exclusive, although it's effectively, on the data is exclusive there. The patent right, to get a patent you need to pay marketing, you have to pay for not only the marketing authorization fees, but also patent fees, which are appreciable, obviously. And then there's the cost of proceedings if you actually have to defend your patent, and the risk of those proceedings failing and you losing your exclusivity. Well, you don't need to worry about that with regulatory exclusivity. No one is allowed to use your data. They have to go back to square one and conduct their own clinical trials to get their product on the market. So, whereas at the absolute most, under a patent, you can get 20 years monopoly, plus an SPC period, a supplementary protection certificate period, which would at most be 5 years, but would in practice be less. With the regulation, you have essentially an unlimited monopoly, unless someone comes along and goes to the trouble of undertaking those clinical trials, which they might. They might go, well, your market is so big, or we'll go and do it. But essentially, the exclusivity is much higher. Sorry, patent attorneys. And that is it.
Okay, and that was a great presentation from Julian last week. And just to follow up on that, he did answer a few questions as part of our podcast series. So with that, I will hand back to our chair for the next part of this talk, an introduction of Chris Bravery.
That's right. Hello, we are now going to turn to Christopher Bravery, who I think it is fair to say is considered a regulatory guru of advanced therapies. Christopher worked as a pharmaceutical assessor at the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the MHRA, which you've been hearing about and will continue to be hearing about today. So he has an inside perspective of what it takes for researchers, institutions, and companies to develop a therapy so it will be approved. And Christopher now has been consulting for 11 years or so in this area, and it's for his own company, and he has a science background in transplantation and immunology. And he really brings to this a fountain of knowledge, as I've come to know over the years. And he provides insights into what the regulator's perspective is, or what it is the standards are for actually getting these therapies approved. And with that, I will turn it over to him and thank Chris for his time and sharing this and participating in this session. And I'll just let you know that we're going to follow up with Christopher's talk with a Q&A panel discussion later with him. So over to Chris.
So I'm hoping to follow on a bit from Julian's talk, and what I thought I would discuss really is this concept of regulatory route and data, and a different concept that perhaps you haven't thought about as data requirements, and how I kind of look at these things slightly differently. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to try and get this to work. So I'm going to talk about regulatory route, data requirements, the existing categories, and what happens when you have new technologies. So although this session is largely talking about things like tissue engineered products that are in development today, I want to reflect back to the period when they weren't defined in the law, and say, how would you deal with new technologies if they came along now? So I think Julian will have mentioned this directive, but this regulation, but may not have said a huge amount about it. But Regulation 1394/2007 was in some ways the reason why the MHRA employed me, because I'd been working in a cell therapy company in the years preceding this, and this was under discussion when I arrived at the agency. And I think there was a lot of hopes for it, but what I want to say to you, part of what I want to address really is, did it really change anything? And on some levels it did, and on some levels I think it didn't, personally. So I think Julian has very nicely explained how our legal framework in the European Union and the European Economic Area tends to dice and slice certain things into very distinct categories. So I'm not entirely sure if you can see my pointer, but he talked about medical devices being distinct from medicinal products. He talked about the European Tissues and Cells Directive, which is in essence defining tissues and cells used for transplantation, and how if you more than minimally manipulate those cells, then they're considered medicinal products. So there's an overlap between medicines and tissues and cells, and likewise between blood. So the reality really is that products look something more like this. So where medicines and tissues and cells overlap, that's where you have somatic cell therapy and tissue engineered products sitting. Curiously, I deliberately didn't say that medical devices needed to overlap with medicines and cells in order to have combination products, mostly because this term of tissue engineered products could include a medical device, but actually the way Europe's chosen to define it, they don't necessarily need to have a medical device component. It's actually defined now through the mechanism of action. Now, Julian didn't really talk about that too much, so I won't try and elaborate on it now. So the reality is, and I think it came out of Julian's talk, that depending on what your technology is, you may find that more than one regulatory regime applies to you. What is helpful to know, perhaps, is there's an article in the Medicines Directive which says something along the lines of where the definition of the product might overlap with definitions in other directives, then the Medicines Directive should take precedence. So I generally describe this as the Prime Directive, slightly because I'm a slight sci-fi fan. But the Prime Directive meaning that the Medicines Directive always takes priority over the others. So if you have a medicinal mode of action, you're more likely to primarily focus on the medicinal mode of action, and the device mode is likely to be secondary. But that's not always the case. You can have devices with ancillary medicinal products, where the medicinal product is just providing actually quite a minimal benefit. But that's beyond the scope of what we can talk about here. So this regulation was called the ATMP regulation, and the world seemed to think that it made a huge difference. But by the point it was finally published, and certainly by the time it came into force, I think my own understanding of how regulation works continuously made me realise that it probably wasn't necessary at all. It was a response to the growing interest in tissue engineering. It provided a definition for tissue engineering products, which Julian tried to sort of suggest was considered to be a gap. But personally, I don't think that was necessary. One of the key things is, I think, that it did help with harmonisation across the European Union and the European Economic Area. My second bullet point. Because what we found was that different member states of the Union were interpreting the legal basis slightly differently. And we had a number of cell products on the market around Europe. I don't think there were any gene therapy products, but there were certainly cell therapy products on the market that were not regulated as medicines. So individual member states had chosen not to do that. Now, with this regulation, it became a bit clear, but I will come back shortly in my presentation to mention that two of the definitions Julian gave us for somatic cell therapy and gene therapy products actually existed and were published and were published in 2003. They would have come into force within a year or two of that publication date, so well ahead of this regulation. So we had already defined advanced therapy products. So because they were already defined, despite the fact that we did actually redefine them, made some amendments to the way that they were defined, and we added another category that in my own personal view wasn't really needed. So that makes me say that perhaps the most significant thing that came out of the regulation was really the formation of the Committee for Advanced Therapies, a committee at the European Medicines Agency composed of member state experts who could discuss and develop guidelines and take scientific lead in the evaluation of these particular products. because they have some unique properties that other medicines don't have. But part of my talk will try and let you understand that they're not quite as unique as perhaps we're made out, which is why I'd also argue that maybe the cat wasn't particularly necessary. But it is perhaps useful. I remain undecided about the value of having the cat in the end. Importantly, it did not alter the definition of a medicine. The definitions that Julian went through for tissue engineered products, somatic cell therapy, etc., are actually in the annex of the directive, and I think that puts them in a slightly different legal basis to the core definition in the front of the directive. It's a shame Julian isn't here so we could have that discussion. So where's my other evidence that we didn't even need this regulation, and that the core medicines directive is perfectly capable of dealing with anything that is a medicine? And this is basically the theme of my talk, that the system we have in Europe can cope with any new technology. It doesn't need any particular modification to cope. So I'm showing you here a product called Apligraph, which many of you may be very familiar with. It's what we scientifically would consider a tissue engineered product. Here's Apligraph and there's normal human skin. It looks very much like normal human skin. It has the same sort of layers. Clearly at a more detailed level it'll be missing things like hair follicles and sweat glands, but it basically looks an awful lot like human tissue. It's grown from neonatal foreskin. This is what it looks like in the bottom right hand corner as a disc of product. It can be sutured like skin, but the big question is how much does it behave like skin, but that's something that's probably slightly beyond this talk. But when this was originally authorised by the FDA in 1998, it was authorised in essence as a drug-device combination through the PMA system. So its primary route was as a medical device, although it also, they worked with CBER because it's also obviously a biologic. So why am I raising Apligraph after talking about Europe? Well, it's because it may be it seems to be little known, and in fact I found it quite difficult to find any press releases or anything so long after the fact. But I did manage to find this particular article in Skin Therapy Letters from 2001, which gives you an update on drugs and mentions down here under wound care, graft skin, which is the sort of generic term for Apligraph, was submitted in April 2001 to the European Medicines Agency. It says it's the European Medicines Evaluation Agency here. The name changed from EMEA to EMA a few years later. So actually, many people have forgotten that Apligraph was submitted to Europe for a market authorization through the centralized procedure at the European Medicines Agency as far back as 2001. And I've already told you that the first definition of an advanced therapy medicinal product didn't come out until 2003. And the ATMP regulation itself not until 2007 and didn't come in force until the end of 2009. So how come this was accepted by the European Medicines Agency? And perhaps the other question is, well, why wasn't it approved? Well, it wasn't approved because you may also recall that back in around about 2001, Organogenesis started to get into financial difficulties. It was actually Novartis that had submitted the market authorization in Europe because they were going to be marketing it in Europe. But Organogenesis went into Chapter 11 and the relationship between Novartis and Organogenesis was terminated. So this application to Europe was actually withdrawn before an opinion was reached. Likewise, it's worth remembering that the very first cell therapy product authorised by the European Medicines Agency, called Chondra Select, which has sadly just recently been withdrawn from the market by Digenix, this was approved in 2009. This was actually after the ATMP regulation came into force, but only just. It was submitted before the ATMP regulation came into force. But as I said to you, from 2003 we had definitions for what somatic cell therapy and gene therapy were, but we didn't have a definition of a tissue engineered product. And curiously, this suspension of chondrocytes in a vial, by European definitions, is a tissue-engineered product, but it's a single-cell suspension. Whereas the previous product, Apligraph, I would argue would probably be defined as a somatic cell therapy in Europe. So it's interesting to remember that the way that we scientists look at the definition of these products may not align with the legal definitions. Anyway, I mention this because the development program for ChondroSelect started well before 2003 and well before, and probably well before 2003, before the directive that was published in 2003 was actually conceptual, thought through and drafted. So they must have known that it was possible to be regulated as a medicine, or maybe they changed their strategy. So why am I saying that much of what Julian said isn't terribly important? Well, it's not quite what I'm saying, but what I'm saying is behind the specific product-specific definitions that Julian spent a bit of time focusing on is the background definition of a medicinal product, which he did touch on, but he didn't provide you as it is written in the legislation. And the definition is, it's administered to human beings either with a view to restoring, correcting, or modifying a physiological function by exerting a pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic action. So if it acts through those mechanisms, it's a medicinal product. Just to reflect, because the obvious similar product category that might be considered relevant would be medical devices. And actually, medical devices can also prevent, alleviate disease, modify the anatomy and physiological processes. But the important thing is medical devices don't achieve this through a pharmacological, immunological, metabolic means. So while it's true, as Julian says, that finding the borderline between these legal categories can sometimes be fraught with difficulties, and some of the classification decisions of regulators are questioned by the public because it's very hard to understand in some cases how they reach those definitions. It's important to remember that that's just a subcategory, and behind that there's the decision of whether it was a medicine or not in the first place. And so actually my argument in this talk is the subcategory of medicine is actually of a lesser importance to you. What it really does is help you identify which guidelines are the most relevant to what you're working on. It doesn't really affect your legal basis in anything like the way that you might imagine. And just to perhaps paint a little bit more of a story, because I find that ATMP developers often think that they're the only ones that develop weird and wonderful medicines. This particular product on the screen now isn't quite as weird and wonderful as it might immediately appear. I must emphasize that the photograph of the rabbit being milked is not from the company. I managed to find a picture of a rabbit being milked, and I wanted to put it on the image so you can get a feel for what the product is. But Julian talked about genetically modified organisms. Well, this is a biotech product. It's not an ATMP. The genetically modified organism that is used to manufacture the product is this rabbit. And the product is deliberately designed to be secreted into the milk of the rabbit, and the rabbit is milked, and the milk's collected, purified, and becomes the product Ruconest. And it's a C1 inhibitor, so a complement inhibitor. So this is exactly the same as using a cell substrate that's genetically modified to express a protein which is then grown in fermentation, but they've chosen to do it in a different way. And it's brought them into the GM rules in a way that having a transgenic cell, a genetically modified cell line doesn't. It's somewhat more complicated. But you can see that even biotech can be considerably more complicated than many people think. And then I thought it was worth throwing this image in here. Here's a maggot. So we know that maggots have been used medically, But what are they in terms of the law? Are they a medical device, or are they a medicine, or are they none of these things? Well, based on mechanism of action, I recall when I was at the agency, a company coming in and pointing out that the mouth parts of the maggot contain something called a radula, which is like a horny disc with little teeth on it, which it grinds tissue off, dead tissue away, and eats it. So the company suggested this should be a medical device. The agency, from my memory, eventually decided it was actually a medicine. And that's partly because, if I recall, maggots also secrete enzymes which digest the tissue. So that enzymatic action was considered more of a medicinal action, and probably applying the rule of, well, if in doubt, call it a medicine. They may well have decided that medicine was the right way to go. Now, is there a licensed medicinal maggot product? Not as far as I can determine. I don't think any have actually been authorised. What they're actually doing is using that route that Julian mentioned, the specials, because they're not used very often, and the company just provides them under a specials license. But in legal terms, we would define these as a medicinal product. And likewise, you may have heard of things like parasites being considered to be developed as medicinal products, parasites that can help to stimulate the immune system in a way that helps to dampen autoimmune responses that are believed to evolve because of not having many parasites in our normal immune system. So I think I've got about 10 minutes, so I need to make sure I speed up a little bit. So let's address this question of regulatory route versus data requirements. So in my view, once you've determined you're a medicine, you know your regulatory routes, the ones that are available to you, because these have not changed for many years and are not any different whatever the product is. And that, by which I mean, is the legal regulatory route. So here's the Medicines Directive, and you'll notice there's a great list of amendments that have been made to it over the years. I've mentioned 2003-63 in the context of being the first directive that identified the term advanced therapy medicinal product and provided two of the definitions we have today, which, although they've now been modified. But that same directive contains what's known as Annex 1. And Annex 1 provides the general data requirements both for all medicinal products and for certain subcategories. So Part 1 is the standardised market authorisation dossier requirements. And then Part 2 talks about some of the potential routes to, for market authorisation. I had considered talking about some of these abridged routes in more detail, but I won't have time for that. But I do come back in one slide. Part 3 of that, of the annex, picks out certain subcategories of medicinal product. And as you can see, largely biological medicinal products are just clumped together in one category. And that would, until Part 4 existed, include the additional information you might need for an ATMP. But now you also have another section that also talks about ATMP specifically. But it includes plasma-derived radiopharmaceuticals. So all it does is pick out some specific difficulties or issues with those types of medicinal products and then provides, some additional requirements or not for those. Sometimes you're exempt from certain requirements where they're not valid or possible. So without Part 4, until that was amended by the regulation I mentioned, you would have had to have just looked at the general requirements for biological products, and that was all the advice you would get. So going back to the route to market, it's really the legal basis to which you get a market authorization. So you can do that nationally or multinationally in Europe through some mutual recognition procedures, or you can do the centralized procedure with the European Medicines Agency. And certain types of product are mandated to use the European Medicines Agency, meaning you can't ask your national authority to authorize it. And that now includes ATMPs, but it also includes orphan products and all products of recombinant DNA technology, so broadly listed here as biotech products. but also certain indications. So all viral diseases, for example, need to be authorised through the EMA. And the idea is twofold. It's one, to make sure that new medicines are available to all citizens of the European Union. And the second principle is that we are consolidating expertise at the European Medicines Agency such that all the national competent authorities in the different member states don't need all this expertise. They can draw on the expertise of each other. So if you come along with a new technology, and let's say it isn't an advanced therapy, then you're not immediately mandated to use the EMA unless you're exploring your product in an orphan indication, or it's a product of recombinant DNA technology in the first place. But if it is a novel new technology, that is actually another criterion in which the EMA will happily take responsibility for the approval. If we had more time, I could tell you a bit about these national approval schemes, but, in all honesty, when you look at them, you think it's an awful lot easier to get one license which is valid for 31 countries. That's all the member states of the European Union plus the EEA, rather than having to go one by one or select the ones you have through that sort of system. So the route that you want is probably the centralised. And then after that, the only differences then are whether you're a full market authorisation, which it comes under Article 8.3, but you don't need to worry about that bit. So a full application means you need all the data of a complete development programme. And then there are situations which are not going to apply here where you can offer less data and reference the data of other people. And the classic one there is generics. We all know about generics. They're for small molecules only. So if somebody has developed a small molecule, all you have to do is show you can make the same small molecule and you can reference their clinical data. Now, I think the extended version of Julian's talk talked about data protection periods. So in order to protect you from generic competition, you're given 10 years market exclusivity. And likewise, if you developed a biosimilar product, you can only do that after the innovator's product's been on the market for at least 10 years. And, of course, assuming patents have cleared. But biosimilar products require a lot more data than a generic. And what I would have liked to have included in this talk, but there really isn't time to cover it, is the fact that for advanced therapy products, I think this concept of biosimilar almost certainly won't apply, which means that this concept of data protection periods is not relevant to probably not relevant to ATMPs either. So we know the legal framework. If you can ask the question, is my principal mode of action medicinal or something else? If you decide it's medicinal, then you know the legal framework. There are only a few legal bases for having a market approval. You may or may not have other legal regimes like the medical device regime that you also need to comply with. But then really you have a recipe for what to do. You have a recipe in the sense of you have a regulatory route. I found it quite puzzling a decade ago when lots of ATMP developers kept saying to me, but we don't know what the regulatory route is. And that's because the legal route was always there, and I hope I've explained that to you and shown you that that is the case. So even if your specific type of fancy new technology is not described in the legal in the legislation yet, it doesn't mean that it's not possible to use the system to gain an approval. So it became clear to me that when people were asking me what the regulatory route was, they were asking me partly what the legal basis for submission was, but they were also probably asking me what data do I need to generate. And with only a few more minutes to go, hopefully only a couple more minutes to go, it's quite hard to give you a clear answer to that in very, very small amount of time, except by condensing it down to the very basis of which any medicine is approved, which is you demonstrate that the product itself is of a good quality. That means you can make it consistently and it has pure or few and safe levels of impurities. Well, it gets more complicated than that, as you can imagine. And what do I mean by this? But in essence, that's what they're asking you to do. You demonstrate that it's safe. You do that in a stepwise approach. So you start in animals where possible and you move into man, and you do it in a careful and considered way. And once you've established that it's safe, you can move on and evaluate its efficacy, such that eventually at the end of your development program, you can evaluate the risks versus the benefits and come up with a risk-benefit assessment about whether the product is approvable in the sense that it provides more benefits to patients than it risks. So the actual data you need is going to be very dependent on the underlying science. And while everybody seems to imagine that it must be easy to list it all out, it first requires you to understand the science. And as the developer of the new science, it's you that has that knowledge. And if you go to the regulators early with new technology, the first thing you'll find is they'll look puzzled at you because they may never have heard about it before. I mean, they may have had other discussions, but they don't know about it. If they don't know about it, if they haven't done any assessment, then there's going to be much less they can do to help you. So one just slight warning is if you have new technology, just be very prepared and don't go for discussions with regulators without thinking it through and preparing, because you do run the risk of potentially scaring them. You run the risk of potentially confusing them if you don't present it clearly. And those things can add to the barriers to getting started, because with any new technology, the regulator is going to be inherently cautious about how quickly they allow you to proceed. Now, I should say that with tissue engineered products and somatic cell therapy products and the like, there's a lot of experience now, and these issues no longer exist in the sense of the regulator being frightened about these products. But where you've used perhaps new technology for the genetic modification, like the new CRISPRs and so on, they are going to raise new regulatory questions. So I'm cognizant of the fact that I need to have finished by now, so I'm going to be very quick. The real problem is when you've got new technology, you, the pioneer, has to work it out. You need to go and have discussions with the regulator, but make sure that you're prepared for those discussions before you go. And somehow you need to figure out how to develop a package of data that shows quality, safety and efficacy in the absence of any specific guidance. Because where the technology is new, it won't exist. And until many products have been at least been through scientific advice procedures with the agencies, and preferably some have been approved, the regulators are reluctant to write guidelines because they need to fully understand what the issues are so that they can provide you some generalized advice. So all of the rest of it is just science. There are aspects of the regulatory system that are designed there to help you, like pharmacopoeias, which help you deal with things like raw materials. But you're going to have to figure it out if you've got some new technology. And the thing is, if you've never developed a product of any type before, then the skill set you need initially is people that have developed other sorts of medicinal product, who have that understanding about how it works, and of course access to a regulatory professional who can understand how the regulatory system works. But if they come back to you and tell you, well, there's no regulatory route for this product, then you've got the wrong regulatory expert, because the route is there. It could be used for anything that has a medicinal property. It's very hard for me to imagine that you would have technology that didn't fit. Not that there wouldn't be some issues to solve, but they will be there. The point is that the way it works is incredibly flexible. It's mostly via guidelines. If there aren't guidelines, then you make it up as you go along and just justify it based on good scientific argumentation to the regulator. So the upside is you've got lots of flexibility. The downside is you have a moving target and you have to figure it out for yourself. There's no recipe here because this is the forefront of science. So how can we write a prescriptive standard or, checkbox of what you need to do? It's just not possible. But that is what you as an industry would want. Trust me, the more you think about it, the more you realise that you just wouldn't want the regulators writing guidelines for things that didn't exist, and trying to produce checklists for you, because you may want to do it in a different way, and right now you have that flexibility. So I'm not going to go to the last two slides, but the next one just gives you some reading material that I'm sure will be available to you afterwards, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Christopher. That was a really interesting talk and very insightful. And yes, we'll make sure that that reading material is passed on through the material we'll distribute after this webinar. I'm going to pass back to MacKenna, who I think is going to chair the Q&A session.
Yep, that's right. So yes, thank you again, Christopher. That's an excellent overview of the regulatory framework and the key regulations. We actually have had quite a few questions come in that we're going to try and address now, directed to you, Chris. So I'm going to start with, pardon?
I said great, that's fine, I'm
okay.
here.
They're here and coming. Some of them are regular, or kind of general, and some of them are more specific. I have a couple too, if we get a chance. So to kick off, we have a question from Sandra in the audience who's asked, what regulations cover products of human origin that are a part of the ATMP production process, but not the final product itself, which you did touch a bit on, if you wanted to answer that.
So you are talking about the use of other human-derived raw materials for the process, I guess. So there's no specific rules. So the tissues and cells directive, for instance, that Julian mentioned, that's only where you're going to use the tissues and cells for clinical applications, which could be to make a medicine or it could be something else. But that's not quite the same as taking a tissue and, say, extracting a protein and then using that protein as a raw material. There, really, it's the medicines regime that would control the safety aspects of that. You would need ethical consent to collect that material, but it wouldn't be necessarily under the Tissues and Cells Directive, although there will be other legislation, which Julian would have been able to explain better than me, probably. The other kind of common one that's used is blood. So actually the blood, however, for whatever purpose you're using it, if you're using it to manufacture a medicine, it should still also comply with the blood directive, because like the Tissues and Cells Directive, these are public health legislation and they're about protecting us against transmission of disease. So you need to do the appropriate testing, but otherwise you would be free to use the blood product in manufacturing as a raw material.
Right.
If I missed the point of the question, do let me know.
Yeah, I was also going to throw out there that my understanding is that those listening to the webinar have in their control panel the option to click on questions, and they can submit them there, and they're passed on to me. So if there's anything that comes up later, we're also, in particular in regards to Julian, I think we have one question that's quite specific to him. What you can do is there'll be a chance for Julian to answer through a LinkedIn session, an exchange of question and answer as well. If that's so, just send in your questions through those in the webinar, and if anything for specific for Julian, we can engage in with him on LinkedIn. All right. Second, we have a question here that's quite a general question. If you have any general advice for an early career researcher, basically in how to prepare for both an entrepreneurial and commercial research career. I think I'll add on to that to say if there's any key pointers you would say to many of these researchers looking to establish a startup in the often dealing with the ATMP space. Any fundamental key golden wisdom you would give?
Difficult one to know where to start. I think actually if you're going to develop a new medicinal product, then and you're just thinking generally about product development, then I think one thing that I recommend, and this is irrespective of the type of product, any sort of product, is to consider this concept of a target product profile. And the idea there is to map out what it is you think you're trying to invent, if you like. So what would be the indication? What would be the desired presentation of the product? What are the expected clinical outcomes? How much of it would you need, etc., etc. There's some good guidance on the FDA website around this concept. And the reason why I would say that was a brilliant place to start is because the idea is starting with the end in mind is the phrase that goes with target product profile. So you try and decide what it is you're trying to eventually achieve, and then you can work backwards and find steps towards achieving that. It's also sometimes, particularly with new technology, a really good way of conveying to your potential investors and other partners what it is you're trying to do with your technology, because sometimes you can get a bit stuck with describing what the technology is without explaining how it might be used. So they can be very useful for business plans as well. You can share them with the regulators if you wish. They can find it quite useful to understand, but they can be a great basis for planning a development program.
Okay, well, I think that that's a constructive way to, as guidance pointers to anyone out there who's looking to develop the therapy. And I think with that, I would have a more general question here about resources. And this question is from an audience saying, where can we find all the rules and regulations for our reference? Exactly, find everything in one place. But then they go on to ask, are they free to view? Or do we need a special license to view them? And I'll answer, no, you don't need a special license. They are absolutely reviewed public. Christopher has already mentioned.
Yes.
Yeah. Well,
yes and no. Yes and no. Actually, even I will admit, and I, consider myself a regulatory professional, that there is a baffling array of places you can get useful advice.
Splinter.
I think the thing to do is to divide what you mean. So there's some good scientific information from a lot of different sources. Even people like the WHO produce a lot of stuff that encompasses the main principles in which we regulate, and provides a lot of scientific discussion and backdrop in a way that, for instance, the European Medicines Agency guidelines don't tend to. So the WHO reports can be very useful. The individual agencies should list out their own scientific guidelines on their websites, but I agree with you that some of them are a bit difficult to find, but those guidelines are all free to access. If you were going to start somewhere, I would say go to the ICH, that's the International Convention of Harmonization, and read the biotech guidelines on ICH. None of them are written with cell therapy in mind, although they've been looking at gene therapy a little bit and thinking about writing some guidelines in that area. There's at least a position paper on shedding. But those will convey the regulatory principles. Other sources that are surprisingly useful are the pharmacopoeias. The pharmacopoeias are something you need a subscription for, although you may be able to get that through your university library if you're working in a university or other sources. But unfortunately, you do have to pay for the pharmacopoeias. And then beyond that, it's kind of difficult to say. I mean, I have tried a little bit on my own website to create some web tools, which are getting a little bit out of date, but are an attempt to sort of collect together guidelines that might be relevant for cell products, for example, into one sort of little collection, so that you can click on them. They link through to the guideline and covering different areas. And there are a few other initiatives along that line. And I mentioned in my reading list something that was written by the BSI. I was actually the technical author for the BSI, called PAS, Publicly Available Specification Number 83. And we tried very hard to identify some key guidelines and bits of legislation in there, covering both Europe and the US. But it's hard, I agree.
It is. It's hard to find a consolidated place, I think.
Yes, it's everywhere.
But it is. There's a flood of information. It is generally freely accessible, but some, of course, it can be consolidated, such as the pharmacopoeias, pulled together, but that requires a subscription. Just to recap, it sounds a bit like the FDA website you suggested as well. It's a good place to look through. And in your slides, you listed some reading materials. Those slides will be available to the webinar freely on the website, the TERMIS-EU website, and then anything to do with the World Health Organization, individual agencies, and the ICH are good places to start.
Yeah. And I would say, can I just say, if you read the, let's say, the FDA guideline, it didn't make sense, go and look at the EMA one and see if that makes sense, because I found that sometimes, you know, one agency writes a much clearer and sort of more comprehensible guideline than the other one. So and yet they're both working to the same principles. Most of us are now harmonized through this concept of ICH. So our underlying principles are the same. Yeah.
Yeah. I often flip between the EMA and the FDA, sometimes just to help pad out the concepts that the principle they're driving at. The second one is, again, it's going to resources. It says, what do you recommend to help us keep up to date with news in tissue engineering and regenerative medicine? So I just want to know if you have any pet favorite resources that you often go to stay abreast in this field.
I confess I don't know. I rely
You just already know it, Christopher.
No, I rely more on sharing between my colleagues, actually, than looking for specific resources. So one way or another, my network, someone usually spots something that looks interesting that's popped up somewhere, and somehow it gets back to me. But it's kind of hard to stay up to date. I completely agree, even when it's what you do for a living.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can say is that usually these topics, if something is really developing in the field, it becomes a hot topic, and you start to have, it gets coverage through academia and also through news, the science media. And I tend to find things like Fierce Biotech and those kind of, you'll start seeing it in the headlines, and it becomes something you're aware of. So subscriptions to those kind of science media collective aggregators is very useful as well.
And things like LinkedIn, people do share pertinent new information, although I've noticed that the discussions are looking less and less like discussions on there now, and more like advertising mostly. But in comments and stuff. And this is quite a long one. Now this, I think this, I'm going to read this out, but it might not be, I don't think this is going to be one that you might want to speak to, because this looks a bit directed towards Julian, and it might be one for the LinkedIn discussion. But this is from Andreas, and it's asked, can you tell us what that one application in the UK was? I think this is in reference to hospital exemption. And this is because this person was involved at UCL Institute of Ophthalmology, Moorfields Eye Hospital, where they did use the hospital use exemption, was seen as a possible route, but they don't know if you're referring to maybe them, or who actually was the one that what institution made that application. Yeah, so all I know is that there was at least one, and that was because Jan Rees, who's a GMP inspector, mentioned it at some meeting a couple of years back. The MHRA, last time I looked at least, don't publish any of that information. You could plausibly ask under Freedom of Information, but I think their general approach has been, because the special system is much more flexible, then you may as well choose that instead of hospital exemption, and then it gives you more opportunities to be more flexible with how you use the product. For instance, export is allowed, as Julian mentioned. And I think that's the main reason, because we've got something like, there was a commission report that suggested, I can't remember, I think we had 12 ATMPs available through specials. And the next closest was something like Germany, with about 10 under their hospital exemption system. So we're allowing quite a lot of products to use this system in the UK.
Well, and I feel like I can't let you slip away yet without asking, just out of curiosity, your views on how the Cures Act in the States is going to impact this pathway. And do you see any changes that really need to be considered?
I haven't honestly thought about that, I must admit. I mean, because it's not part of our legislation, it's not entirely clear to me whether it will impact us at all. So I'm sorry, no, it's just not something I've thought about yet, actually.
No, that's fine. I think it's something that's still very much in discussion at most conferences in the States, as it is. So it's a bit early days for how that's going to play out. And then I just wanted to ask you. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, most of these things sound a lot more exciting than they turn out to be. Yeah. I'm going to avoid asking the Brexit question in that regard. But I did want you to speak to specifically the advantages of going the orphan status.
orphan designation and spelling that out, and also the advantages of being a small, medium-sized enterprise as well.
Yes, okay, I can talk to that quite easily.
Yeah.
So both of those statuses really, so SME status you can apply for. It's very quick and easy to do. The criteria are that your organization needs to be small enough to be considered a small to medium-sized enterprise. So there's some limits on the overall turnover and number of staff and so on. And all of that's available on the EMA website, and I can't remember the specific numbers. But assuming that you are a small to medium-sized enterprise, then the EMA will give you some fee reductions as incentives to help you as a small company. And actually, they're quite significant, because if I use, for example, the cost of gaining scientific advice from the European Medicines Agency, the actual cost is something in the order of oh, no, that's annoying. So it's something in the order of 100 and something thousand, maybe it's 80,000 euros or something like that. That's right. I'm trying to remember the number. It's a big number anyway, a scary number. If you're an SME, you get a 90% discount for going to scientific advice, so that brings you down to maybe 8,000 euros, which is considerably cheaper. So if you're Pfizer or something developing a mainstream product, you'd pay that full fee to get EMA scientific advice, for example. So SMEs get similar sorts of discounts for various other activities that you normally have to pay for with the EMA. The other side of it is the orphan designation, and that's where I may give you a slightly different answer to some. In the US, orphan designation also provides you some tax benefits and so on. Because Europe is a group of member states that are collaborating together, it wasn't really possible to come up with a system that gave you some sort of tax break, because the tax systems of all the member states are too different. So it only actually gives you discounts on the cost of the EMA. So scientific advice, your actual market authorization, your pre-market GMP inspection, your post-market activities, your pharmacovigilance, all that stuff that you have to do with the EMA. There's there's annual license fees and so on. Mm-hmm. So to incentivize you, if you're working in an orphan indication, they give you quite significant fee reductions. And in many cases for small companies, that means everything's free, at least for maybe a year after you're approved and leading up to that. So the bit that's different to what other people might say to you is, I would say, the question is, when should you submit? Because you have to maintain the orphan designation, you have annual reports. So I've seen companies or developers, universities indeed, submit for a request for orphan designation for a preclinical product, which is about as early as you can do it. You really have to demonstrate that you genuinely got a product in mind. And the thing there is that, well, when will you go and seek the services of the European Medicines Agency? You might not do that actually until you've completed phase 2. So why would you orphan designate too early? Because you're just making work for yourself. So I would seriously think about when you do it. But once you've got it, it means you can get significant fee reductions for scientific advice and then the eventual market authorization application. The thing to remember, though, because there seems to be a misunderstanding out there, is an orphan designated product isn't a product that has lots of its data requirements stricken off. It's not something that can be less good. The quality of the product should still be exactly the same as any other medicine. Just because the patient has a rare disease, it doesn't mean to say they don't require the same, they don't justify the same standards. The difference really comes with the risk-benefit assessment, where there are no other benefits that the patient could have. Then you can accept perhaps more risks, particularly if they've got a life-threatening disease. And it can also affect the amount of data, clinical data you have, because obviously it's a rare disease, it might not be possible to collect the usual amount of clinical data. So in conjunction with your orphan designation, you might maybe get a conditional market authorization, or for something like in the case of Bravery, which is a gene therapy, and exceptional circumstances. But that's only conditional and exceptional on the difficulties of generating the clinical data. The rest of the data package should be complete and of the same standard.
I think that kind of touches on everything I wanted to other than perhaps maybe the market exclusivity advantages. Do you see any?
Yes, that one's a difficult one to fully understand, to be honest, because they are rare diseases and not that many of them, not many of the designations go through to approval. Then how many occasions have more than one product been up for approval for the same indication? And what seems to often be the case is that the treatment is either, the second treatment in that indication is either superior or is treating the patient in a slightly different way, so isn't really considered, is considered as complementary rather than, you know, in the same space. So I don't have much experience of really how that pans out. I can imagine if you're working on a CAR T for CD19 at the moment, you're probably really interested in how that's going to happen. But right now, I'm not entirely sure. But in theory, yes, you have market exclusivity for your orphan indication for a period of time, which
there are advantages.
Can be extended.
I agree with you.
Pediatrics.
Yeah, exactly, with the pediatric exceptions. But that's also very a limited exception. But I agree with you that I think that probably the most interesting area for this topic is in immunotherapy, and often with the chimeric antigen.
Yes, I think we'll be watching that play out in the next couple of years.
Yeah, and I think you're right, though. I think that it won't be that they'll be seen as competing rivals, but they'll be seen as complementary, or one will simply be more effective than the other. But they'll find a different way of administering it slightly. They'll redesign the CAR in a way that it will be a separate, it won't actually be directly knocking out the other competitor therapy, I imagine, is what's going to happen. But it's tricky in that space.
Yes.
And then I was going to, we do have a final question from the audience, as Oliver Ball asked in regards, you spoke a bit about this, and you were basically offering assurance that there is a path to market, and no one should be saying that this hasn't been explored before. But when you are dealing with a cell-based product that's difficult to characterize, what would you recommend in how to actually go to start to commercialize that product? And what should be, is it really by having, let's say, a strong target product profile? What are your recommendations when you have that?
I mean, the key is like with any other product, really. It's coming up with a good proof of concept, and that can be very challenging with cells because the animal models may not be actually at all useful. And for example, with immunotherapies, it's pretty hard to think of an animal study that you can do when the product is designed to interfere with the human immune system, which is different to the immune system of any other animal, really. Short, perhaps, of some of the old world, some of our closer relatives in the primate world, which thankfully European regulators do their best to avoid as far as possible. We're not very keen on encouraging people to use those anyway. So I think the key really is coming up with a decent proof of concept before you actually start to invest an enormous amount of time and effort. Because even even to get to your first in human clinical study requires you to develop a manufacturing process, to undertake some sort of preclinical studies. If they can't be in animals, then maybe they can be in vitro, organ culture, and other systems. But somehow you need to come up with the evidence that it will at least not do any significant harm when it's administered to humans, but really, as a developer, you want some idea that it might actually be beneficial. And in fact, actually, when you go first into humans, you really do need an argument that it could benefit the human, because it would be an unusual situation where you would put a cell therapy into a healthy volunteer. I can't particularly actually I can think of one product that maybe that I've seen that happen in, and that was a treatment for wrinkles with cells, yeah, which is the what's it called? Was Isologen's FibroCells product, Laviv, for example. I expect they used healthy volunteers because arguably everybody's healthy. But you don't normally put it into healthy volunteers, so you do need to come up with some sort of justification that they might benefit to some degree. And that really is the challenge, I think, before you embark on a lengthy development program, is really just trying to be sure that it's worth going forward with this product. And to think, I mean, the target product profile should also help you think about what the overall cost of the product might be. And then it's worth looking at what they call the headroom or the headspace, or what do drugs and treatments in this indication normally cost? What's the likelihood that I could make this in that cost? Or how much more cost could I charge if it had more benefit? So you might be able to come out with an algorithm that if it's going to cost £10,000, then it needs to have twice the efficacy of the standard of care today. And then you have a target for your development. Whether or not that's achievable is, of course, down to the science.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to say an enormous thank you to both of the speakers for your time and excellent talks, even with a little bit of clash, I'd say, on where the emphasis is. But I really do appreciate that. So, and I know that you weren't feeling particularly well, Chris, so I'm more appreciative.
I have a cough, sorry.
That's all right. It's all right. So thank you very much. And I think at this point, I will conclude our panel discussion and pass over to Tracy, who's going to be discussing the business plan competition that's going on with the TERMIS-EU organization. And thank you very much. And if there's any further questions or so forth, please do submit them, and we can try and address them individually later. So, and the slides and that will be available on the website, as will the webinar and audio.
Thank you very much, MacKenna, for the next intro. So in the next 10 minutes, I will talk you through the 2017 business plan competition submission. So first, give you an overall on the competition itself. I guess some of you may already familiar with TERMIS. Basically, is Tissue Engineering, Regenerative Medicine, and Tissue Engineering and Regenerative Medicine International Society. And we, as a committee, we run the business plan competition program. And the aim of this program is to inspire and equip innovative early career researchers in term fields and accelerate the translation of their life-changing ideas from bench to market. And here's the 4 key elements we provide through the program. So first, you can see the training program basically is the pre-accelerator program, which we are having today. This is the 3rd session today. So in the coming year, we will have another sessions which cover IP aspect, covering marketing and marketing strategies, as well as manufacturing, production, and also a session given by Kathy talking about how to build a business plan, basically all the elements which are required for writing a business plan. And then about the scale up boost. So by joining this competition, students and early career researchers will be guided through the application submission process. We will tell you about how to make the online application very soon. And the TERMIS BPC is basically designed for the academics or people who start from academic background. For example, entrepreneurs who start their entrepreneurial journey from the exciting discovery in the lab. We provide a framework to create a business plan, help the innovative researchers to understand the challenges that going to bring the marketing, the financial, clinical, regulatory, computation, manufacturing, and etc. Besides giving the participants the framework for writing the business plan, the business plan competition will result in a live presentation to a panel of industry expertise at the conference. And third is about the mentorship. So if successful enter the round 2, each semi-finalist teams will be paired with 2 mentors, and these 2 mentorship from the leading industrial partners to provide and develop their business plan and get through the program. We've seen the communication and relationship between the participants and mentors have gone beyond the competition itself, which is very helpful for your business development and building step by step of your entrepreneur journey. And next is the networking opportunity. So all of the finalists and the semi-finalists will be invited to join the networking event during the conference, at which we will also bring different parties in, including all the entrepreneurs, industrial leaders, academic leaders, investors, IP regulatory expertise, etc. And here's the overview of 2017 business plan competition. So as we can see here, the application will open start from today, and the deadline is 27th of January, midnight GMT time. So during the application process, during the round 1 application process, if you have any question or if you want to find a team member or want to discuss some specific question, you can join the Slack communication space, which is showing on the screen here. You can tap in the link, then you will have the invitation to join the Slack. So we will have our BBC community member there, but we also have other participants which you can discuss questions or communicate. Also, if you have some specific questions, you can send email through the email address showing here, and we will try to get back to you within 48 hours. And during the Christmas time, we may have limited access, but we'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. And here is a brief guideline on how you can actually submit application. So on the first screen, you can see the window is when you open up the website, you will see this window. And here you can click on the apply for 2017 to go into the online application form. Or another way is you can go into the main website. On the competition page, you can see there's apply now, and you can click there. Then these 2 options will all link you to this page, which is the online application form. So here, basically, you fill all the required information about your team, about your startup, your idea, your application. And this is the step 1, the first page. I will skip the step 2, which you will see it during the application process. And here is a key of the main part of this application. So basically, it's a business plan questionnaire, and that's quite different compared to other competition. So here we aim to give you a quite detailed guideline on what kind of answer we are looking for or how you can address it. So after each question, we have like 1 line or 2 line description, and also we have what limit. The same, if you have any question you want to discuss, you can bring the question to the Slack space or send us an email. We're very happy to help you go through the application process. And bear in mind, the application deadline is 27th of January, midnight GMT time. And this page shows all the key lines of this 2017 business plan competition. You will also find this timeline on the website. But here, just bear in mind the deadline of the first round application is 19th of December, start from 19th December today, and the submission will be closed on 27th of January. After the first round, if you succeed at this first round, you will be entering the second round. As mentioned, during the second round, you will be paired with 2 mentors. They will get you through the application process, and you can have some communication and prepare the full business plan together, or even the final pitch together. And if you succeed from the second round, you will be invited to enter the final competition, which the top 5 finalists will be present their final business plan to the audience, to the panel of judges there. And that's all for me. If you have any questions, please we discuss at the Slack or via emails. Thank you very much.
Okay, so it's a really exciting opportunity for any early career researchers, and especially to present to a panel of industry experts at the TERMIS-EU conference next year. And just as a summary, we have a discussions on the LinkedIn forum, which is listed on this slide, and also we're publishing on medium.com all the descriptions and summaries of the actual sessions themselves, written by our committee members, and they're accessed at medium.com/TERMISBPC. All the links on the website will go to that. There's more descriptions about the session itself, and also the podcasts that are derivative of the actual webinars. So you'll see the talk extension from Julian Hitchcock and our questionnaire and podcast session with him last week. So with that, thanks very much for joining us. My name has been Shiraz Ziya. I'm the communications lead, and thanks to Tracy, Oliver, MacKenna for organising this session. And thank you very much, and keep in touch with us, and see you next year.